Let's talk a little bit about the consolidation of the book industry, because of
Sure.
course, over the last few decades, we've seen the publishing industries go through enormous consolidation in order to try and achieve growth amid flat or even declining sales. And what have we ended up with? We were like 5 mega publishers, 1 online bookseller, and particularly in some countries, very limited physical sellers for books as well. So what do you think that means both for the kinds of books that are produced and as well as for the people that write them?
Well, so I think there's like good news and bad news, and the good news isn't very good. So the good news is that this is not a literary phenomenon. We also have consolidation in international shipping and logistics, and consolidation in the petrochemicals industry, and consolidation in finance, and consolidation in the automotive industry, and consolidation in international power markets, and every other industry. And what we actually have is 40 years of, capitalism with the gloves off, where any thought of monopoly regulation has gone by the wayside. And it starts with the Chicago School and their conviction that the only time you ever want to regulate antitrust is when prices are being regulated upwards and never downwards, or not when suppliers are being squeezed. And so it used to be the mere fact that an industry controlled its suppliers, or that it controlled an entire sector, or that a firm controlled an entire sector, was sufficient to trigger antitrust scrutiny and action. Today, it's only if they do that and they raise prices. But if they lower prices, then there's absolutely no antitrust scrutiny. And so this is an epiphenomenon of that. So on the one hand, what that's done is it's created tremendous returns to the capital classes, and it's created enormous pressure on firms to be beholden to their shareholders. In the big 5 publishers, 4 of them are publicly listed. One of them is a bit of a hybrid in that all of its voting shares are controlled by someone who has a separate set of financial interests, but they're still highly financialized. HarperCollins sometimes buys books by politicians in order to curry favor with those politicians and pays over the odds for it. But they still are answerable to shareholders for things that are distinct from the historic role of bookselling. And one of the ways that that's manifested is in these great hollowing outs of publishing, where on the one hand, a lot of their physical plant no longer belongs to them. You see publishers that owned big buildings and CBDs that flogged them off and then rented them back, and then became very liable to shocks as property values went up and rents went really high, and they're a lot more brittle. This has also happened in the newspaper industry. The newspaper industries also sold off their presses and then leased their presses back, and also became very liable to shocks, usually in a bid to fire their unionized staff. So all of this has made them super fragile. And then the industry that was birthed pretty much at the moment that we decided to stop prosecuting monopolism was the tech industry. I don't think tech industry is intrinsically monopolistic. I think it was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so now we have these firms that control the markets horizontally and vertically, and that are globally integrated. They're able to dodge their tax. So back to to the extent that really the only successful policy for getting a really large number of artists paid is subsidy. That subsidy is no longer available because the states have been hollowed out, because they all have this fiction that they're headquartered somewhere in the Irish Sea, and that the money is just like at the bottom of the ocean and not subject to taxation. And so, that has been enormously detrimental to our ability to realize money. They've squeezed authors by merging imprints. The most extreme example, it used to be that hardcover and paperback rights were separately sold. And so you had authors who were able to get bidding wars going twice. And moreover, because your paperback rights were sold after you could see how the hardcover fared, successful authors were able to negotiate for a larger advance on the paperback. And there's this fiction that advances merely reflect a kind of loan against the eventual royalties, and that they're not a de facto change in your royalty itself. The reality is that publishers are so leery of setting precedents in which the royalty rate fluctuates that they'll often create a higher royalty for a favorite author by giving them an advance that they know is over the odds and unlikely to be earned out. Yeah. But with consolidation, you now have cross-collateralization of books, where a book that doesn't earn out in book 1, book 2 of the deal doesn't get any money until book 1 is earned out. You have publishers that are now global and buying rights worldwide, so Harper Voyager and orbit are now both acquiring rights worldwide.
And we're having a big problem with that in Australia. For a lot of Australian authors, particularly genre authors, you'll sell it in the UK. You cannot hold on to the Australian rights,
That's right.
even if you're going to actually sell way more copies in Australia than in the UK. And then you only get the export royalty rate, which is far less than...
Sure, and and then in addition to that, I mean, it may be that your very best publisher in the UK is Penguin, but it may be that there is a boutique publisher in Australia who really understands your market very well and who could pay you a higher advance and sell more copies.
Yeah.
So you don't get to arrange your affairs in the way that's optimal for you. The market power commanded by the large firms means that you're stuck. And because now 2/5 of the global publishing market requires surrender of your global rights, that's now, you're now, if you choose not to go with those two, you have to hope that one of the remaining 3 is willing to publish you and let you retain your Australian rights. And that's a really tough bargain to make. It may be that you only ever get one offer.
Yeah, and more what I'm hearing is that the UK publisher will say no deal if you won't give us the Australia and New Zealand rights as well.
They have. What's increasingly happened is that variations on the standard contracting terms have moved so far up the ladder that the only people who are empowered to grant a variance in ebooks and in global rights, which have become the 2 hot button areas where the publishers perceive an opportunity for growth or losses, that has to go to the CEO or to the head of the imprint or very high up in the corporate ladder. Sometimes to corporate above, so like not Penguin Random but Bertelsmann, and it's just not worth anyone's time, right? Like the amount of political capital within a firm that an acquiring editor has to burn to get their boss's boss to let them make a minor variance in a contract for someone who's selling a first novel for $6,000. Why would they even bother?
Yeah, and they don't, so they move to the next one down the queue.
Sure.
And I'm hearing the new battleground is audiobook rights, because that's really
I've
taken
heard that
off.
too. Yeah.
And that's something that there is very little wriggle room on now in terms of retaining those rights. But I've also made inquiries, well, are the advances getting bigger? Well,
no, they're not. They're not. And that's fine if advances are just get topped up with royalties, and that's the way it works across the board. But again, the reality is that advances are sometimes paid over the odds as a way of de facto bumping up the royalty.
Yeah.
With audio, at least now we have a competitor. I mean, again, Google's not your friend, but Google is now competing with Amazon, and provided that we don't make the category error of assuming the enemy of our enemy is our friend, then at least we can see how that might be useful, if not if not entirely aligned with our interests, as a way of forcing Amazon to do better. I mean, Audible's dirty tricks can't be overstated. They do things like buy the first volume in a series, and then if it doesn't do well, they don't buy any of the rest, but they don't revert the first one, and so the author is stuck with 6 books they can't sell because the first one is owned exclusively by Audible. They squeezed out all their production partners and started going directly to their readers, but not paying them union rates.
Right.
Or they squeeze their production partners. They will do audiobooks where there's no director, and so you have readers who are reading and making cack-handed mistakes, and no one's there to check their pronunciation or to check their usage. It's really it's all the things that you associate with monopolism, right? It's sloppiness, it's greed, it's just poor practice across the board.